The notification came through at 2 in the morning. Jack Rivera was sitting in his workshop, a cup of cold coffee going stale next to his workbench, when his computer pinged with the automated listing alert. He'd set up these notifications years ago, back when he was still hungry to prove something. Now they just filled his inbox with junk. But something made him click on this one. A dragon. For 3 credits. Jack read the description twice, thinking maybe he'd misunderstood. But no, it was right there in the system. Exotic fauna specimen. Defective. Non-functional. Suitable for parts or disposal. The image attached showed something that looked like it belonged in an old fantasy movie, except this thing was real. Its body was covered in scales that caught the light in ways that shouldn't be possible, and there was something wrong about the way it was curled up in that containment cell. Something that screamed suffering to anyone who knew how to listen. Most people would have closed the listing and moved on. Jack had spent 23 years working in salvage, and he'd learned that most things marked as garbage were garbage for a reason. But he'd also built his entire reputation on being the one guy who could look at broken things and see potential. The one who could take what everyone else threw away and turn it into something valuable. His hands moved across the keyboard before his brain caught up with what he was doing. He placed the bid. 3 credits. It was almost an insult, but that was the point. The auction closed within minutes. Jack refreshed the page and saw his name listed as the winning bidder. He sat back in his chair and wondered what the hell he'd just done. The next morning he drove out to Scrapyard 7. It wasn't the kind of place you went to if you had options. The facility sprawled across the edge of the industrial sector, surrounded by fences that looked like they could barely hold back the chaos inside. Mountains of discarded metal, broken machinery, and things that probably shouldn't exist anymore were piled everywhere. The air smelled like rust and regret. The intake manager, a tired-looking woman named Patricia, handed him a data pad with the transfer documents. She didn't even make eye contact. "You're the one who bought the dragon?" "That's me," Jack said. "Good luck with that." Patricia walked away before he could respond. The containment unit was in Bay 9, a reinforced steel box with what looked like carbon scoring marks along the sides. Jack approached it slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light inside. At first he thought maybe the listing had been wrong. Maybe they'd sold him an empty cage. But then something moved. The creature shifted, and suddenly those golden eyes locked onto his. Jack stopped breathing for a second. He'd seen a lot of things in his years of salvage work, but he'd never seen anything look at him quite like this. There was intelligence there. Real, genuine intelligence. And something else he couldn't quite name. The dragon was smaller than he'd expected from the photos. Maybe 3 meters from nose to tail, with wings that seemed too elegant for something that had clearly been through hell. The scales rippled with color, catching light like oil on water, creating patterns that seemed almost intentional. Beautiful in a way that made Jack's chest hurt. But the beauty wasn't why he understood immediately what was wrong. Jack had spent 2 decades understanding broken systems. He could look at a piece of machinery and see exactly where it was failing, what parts didn't fit right, what was fighting against what. It was a gift, his grandfather used to say. And looking at this creature he could read the same story. The previous owners had clearly tried to turn it into something it wasn't built to be. A weapon probably. Something controllable and dangerous and easy to point at enemies. They'd installed things in its body. Jack could see the faint outline of implants beneath the scales, could sense the artificial components that had been grafted into something that was meant to be alive in a completely different way. The dragon's body was literally fighting itself, system against system, the organic refusing to cooperate with the synthetic rejecting the organic. It was like watching a machine that had been designed by someone who didn't understand how the parts actually fit together. Jack knelt down in front of the containment unit. The dragon didn't make any aggressive movements. It just watched him, those golden eyes tracking his every motion with what seemed like hope. Or maybe Jack was just projecting. Maybe he was seeing what he wanted to see. But he didn't think so. "What did they do to you?" he whispered. The dragon's breathing was shallow and irregular, the kind of breathing that told Jack the creature was in pain. Constant, unending pain. The kind that came from having incompatible systems jammed into the same body and left to fight each other forever. Jack stood up and looked at the containment unit's specifications. Military grade. State of the art. Expensive as hell. Whoever had owned this thing before had spent serious money on it. And then they'd given up and sold it for 3 credits. Everyone else saw garbage. Everyone else saw something that didn't work and needed to be destroyed. But Jack saw a puzzle. A broken thing that just might, be able to be fixed. "I'm taking you home," he said to the dragon. Jack brought the dragon back to his workshop in the early evening, moving it carefully in a reinforced transport container he'd borrowed from a friend who asked too many questions. He didn't give many answers. By the time the sun set, the creature, which he'd decided to call Cypher because that's what it was, a puzzle waiting to be decoded, was settled in the largest bay of his facility. The workshop was his sanctuary. He'd built it up over decades, turning an old industrial building into a place where broken things came to be understood. The walls were lined with tools, diagnostic equipment, and repair stations that represented every major technological advancement of the last 50 years. If something was broken, Jack had probably worked on something like it before. But nothing had quite prepared him for Cypher. He spent the first night just running basic scans. Every piece of diagnostic equipment he owned got wheeled over to that containment unit. Thermal imaging, biological sensors, synthetic material analyzers, neural activity monitors. Everything. The readouts came back looking like someone had mixed together 3 different instruction manuals and then thrown them at the wall to see what stuck. The dragon's body was a war zone. Not literally, but that's what it looked like on the screens. You had organic tissue, real, living biological material, that was trying to operate alongside synthetic components that had been installed with the kind of finesse you'd expect from someone wearing thick gloves while performing surgery. The nanomachines, which were supposed to be healing the creature, were actually attacking it. They'd been programmed to see the organic parts as threats, so they were constantly trying to destroy them. Jack sat back in his chair around 3 in the morning and just stared at the data. Someone had built this wrong. Not accidentally wrong. Intentionally wrong. This was a system designed to fail, built with some kind of countdown timer that would eventually result in the creature dying. The person who'd engineered Cypher hadn't wanted a dragon. They'd wanted a walking time bomb that could be pointed at enemies and then safely disposed of once it had served its purpose. "Those bastards," Jack muttered to the empty workshop. Cypher made a sound then, something between a growl and a whimper. Jack looked up and saw the dragon watching him through the transparent panels of the containment unit. Those golden eyes were still full of that intelligence, but now Jack could see something else too. Exhaustion. The look of something that had been suffering for so long that it wasn't even sure what not suffering felt like anymore. "Yeah, I know," Jack said softly. "We're going to fix this. I promise." He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he started planning. The problems were layered and complicated, the kind of thing that would have made most people give up. But Jack wasn't most people. He started by making a list of what needed to happen. First, he had to stop the nanomachines from attacking the organic tissue. Second, he had to get the synthetic implants to work with the biological systems instead of against them. Third, he had to do all of this without causing more damage to a creature that was already barely holding on. The work began the next morning. Jack didn't have off-the-shelf solutions for any of this. He had to fabricate microadapters from scratch, tiny devices that could translate between the synthetic and organic systems, basically convincing them to stop fighting each other and start cooperating instead. He worked with reclaimed biotech equipment, recycled neural interfaces, and his own knowledge accumulated over 2 decades of fixing impossible things. Day after day he sat in front of Cypher, working on these tiny adapters with tools so precise that one wrong movement would ruin hours of work. And through it all, the dragon just watched. Jack had expected the creature to be angry, maybe, or aggressive. Dragons weren't supposed to be patient. They were supposed to be monsters that attacked and destroyed things. But Cypher just observed. There was something almost meditative about the way the dragon's golden eyes followed Jack's hands as he worked. No thrashing. No threatening behavior. Just this calm, quiet presence that somehow made the whole workshop feel safer, even though logically Jack knew that didn't make any sense. 2 weeks into the work, something changed. Jack had been struggling with the integration of the third adapter, trying to figure out the exact sequence that would make the synthetic and organic systems cooperate instead of reject each other. He tried 17 different configurations and failed 17 times. On the 18th try, something clicked. Literally. The adapter hummed softly as it activated, and the nanomachines inside Cypher's body suddenly received new instructions. Stop attacking. Start healing. Work with the organic tissue, not against it. Cypher's breathing changed immediately. It became deeper, more rhythmic, synchronized with the ambient hum of the workshop's machinery. And for the first time, Jack realized that the creature wasn't just breathing anymore. It was breathing in time with the equipment around it, like the workshop itself had become part of the dragon's body. Jack felt his chest tighten. Something had shifted in that moment. Something that wasn't mechanical or physical or something you could measure on a screen. It was something deeper. Something that felt almost like recognition, like Cypher was finally understanding that this strange human who'd bought it for 3 credits wasn't going to hurt it. That someone, finally, was trying to help. Jack placed his hand against the containment unit, and Cypher moved closer, its scaled head pressing gently against the glass. For the first time since he'd brought the dragon to his workshop, Jack felt like maybe, just maybe, this impossible thing could actually be saved. "One down," he whispered. "2 more adapters to go." The first warning came through Jack's security system at dawn. Vehicles approaching. Official vehicles, based on the way they moved and the electromagnetic signatures they were broadcasting. Jack was already awake, sitting in his workshop with a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm hours ago, working on the 4th adapter. He watched the monitors as 3 black transport ships descended toward his facility. By the time they landed, Jack had already made peace with what was about to happen. He'd known this was coming the moment he'd registered Cypher's ownership with the central database. The Valerian Collective didn't just give up on their creations. They certainly didn't let some random salvage mechanic keep something they'd engineered, something they'd invested resources into building. The knock on the workshop door was loud and official. Jack set down his tools and walked over to open it. 6 enforcement officers stood in formation, dressed in the black uniforms that marked them as High Temple security. Their armor was sleek and expensive, the kind of equipment that cost more than Jack made in 5 years. Behind them stood a woman who carried herself with the kind of authority that made the air feel heavier. Director Helena Cross. Jack recognized her from news feeds and government broadcasts. She was one of the upper ranks of the Valerian hierarchy, someone who actually made decisions about what happened to engineered creatures like Cypher. She had sharp features and cold eyes that seemed to assess everything they landed on and find it lacking. "Jack Rivera," she said, her voice smooth and precise. "I'm Director Cross from the Valerian Collective. We're here about the dragon you've taken into your possession." Jack kept his expression neutral. "It's my property. I have the auction documentation." "Those documents are void," Cross said flatly. She didn't raise her voice, but somehow she managed to make it clear that disagreement wasn't really an option. "The creature you're harboring is Valerian property. It was engineered by Valerian science, maintained by Valerian resources, and remains bound by Valerian law. More importantly, it represents a failure that must be corrected." "It's not a failure," Jack said. "It's healing." Cross's eyes narrowed slightly, the only indication that she'd heard him. "The creature rejected its divine purpose. It was designed to be a weapon of precision and control, a demonstration of our mastery over nature and biology. Instead, it malfunctioned. It refused to integrate properly with its programming. It became heresy, an abomination that questions our authority." Jack felt anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "It's not an abomination. Someone made it wrong. I'm fixing it." "You misunderstand," Cross continued as if Jack hadn't spoken. "There is nothing to fix. The creature must be destroyed. Purified. Removed from existence so that no one can look at it and see a challenge to Valerian doctrine." She gestured to the enforcement officers. "You will surrender the beast immediately, or we will incinerate your entire workshop. Your choice." Jack looked past her, through the workshop door, to where Cypher was resting in the containment unit. The dragon's golden eyes were visible from here, watching the scene unfold with that same patient intelligence it had been displaying for weeks. Jack thought about all the nights he'd spent fabricating those adapters, all the failures and setbacks, all the moments when he'd wanted to give up because it seemed impossible. He thought about the moment the 4th adapter had synchronized, when Cypher's breathing had become perfect and rhythmic and alive. He thought about what it meant to be told that something you'd fixed, something you'd saved, had to be destroyed simply because it challenged someone's idea of how the world should work. Jack made a decision that probably seemed insane to everyone watching. He walked past Director Cross, past the enforcement officers, and directly to the containment unit. He could hear Cross calling out orders behind him, could hear the officers moving to stop him, but something in his movements must have communicated that they weren't dealing with a threat. Jack wasn't reaching for a weapon. He wasn't trying to run or hide or resist. He was simply walking toward the dragon. When he reached the containment unit, Jack did something so fundamentally human, so raw and genuine, that it seemed to freeze everyone in the workshop. He knelt. Not in surrender to the Valerian authority. Not in fear or acceptance of what was about to happen. He knelt in front of Cypher, placing his forehead against the cool scales of the dragon's snout. "Show them what you really are," he whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying the weight of everything he'd invested in this creature over the past weeks. "Show them that you're not what they built you to be." Director Cross had frozen mid-order. Even the enforcement officers seemed uncertain, their weapons not quite raised, not quite lowered. There was something about the moment that didn't fit their protocols. This wasn't resistance. This wasn't defiance in the way they understood it. This was something else entirely. This was a human being choosing to kneel beside the very thing he'd been ordered to give up, choosing to stand with it instead of against it. Jack could feel Cypher's breathing beneath his forehead, feel the synchronized rhythm of the dragon's body, the beautiful integration of organic and synthetic, natural and designed. In this moment, kneeling with his forehead pressed against the dragon's scales, Jack wasn't thinking about whether this would save Cypher. He wasn't thinking about whether the Valerian Collective would destroy both of them for this act of defiance. He was simply thinking that some things were worth kneeling for. For a moment nothing happened. Jack knelt there with his forehead pressed against Cypher's scales, and the workshop held its breath. Director Cross stood frozen mid-stride, her hand still raised in what might have been a gesture of command or might have been something else entirely. The enforcement officers remained in their tactical formation, weapons at the ready, waiting for orders that didn't come. Then Cypher breathed. It wasn't a normal breath. Jack felt it through every part of his body, a deep expansion of the dragon's chest that seemed to draw in not just air but something else. Something fundamental. The creature's entire body resonated, and the frequency that emerged from its throat wasn't a roar in any traditional sense. It was music. Pure, crystalline, mathematical music that seemed to reshape the very air around them. The sound started low, beneath human hearing, but Jack felt it in his bones. The nanomachines inside Cypher's body responded first, syncing with the frequency, adding their own vibration to the harmony. Then the organic tissue joined in, the dragon's heartbeat and breathing and neural activity all aligning into a single, perfect resonance. The synthetic implants that had been fighting the biological systems for weeks suddenly understood their role, and instead of resistance they began to sing. It was beautiful. Terrifying and beautiful in equal measure. The workshop itself seemed to respond. The tools hanging on the walls began to vibrate, creating a cascade of secondary harmonics. The diagnostic equipment hummed in perfect synchronization. Even the air felt different, charged with something that science didn't quite have a word for yet. Jack remained kneeling, his forehead still touching Cypher's scales, and he understood in that moment what this sound represented. It wasn't anger or threat. It was Cypher finally, truly expressing what it actually was. Not what the Valerian Collective had tried to make it. Not what it had been broken into being. But what it had become through weeks of careful restoration and the simple act of someone choosing to see it as worthy of saving. The frequency intensified and reality began to bend around it. The glass containers on Jack's workbench started to fracture, but not violently. The cracks spread in perfect geometric patterns, almost like the glass was deciding to remake itself into something new. Metal fixtures on the walls warped gently, as if responding to an invisible hand that was reshaping them with infinite precision. Nothing was being destroyed. Everything was being transformed, adjusted, made to vibrate in harmony with the dragon's song. The enforcement officers' weapons died first. Their sophisticated technology, their neural interfaces, their targeting systems, all of it simply stopped working. Not because they'd been damaged, but because they'd been overwhelmed by a frequency so pure and complex that their circuits couldn't process it. One by one the pulse rifles went dark. The scanning equipment fell silent. Every piece of military hardware they'd brought into the workshop simply ceased to function. Director Cross staggered backward, her hand dropping to her side. Her face had gone pale, and for the first time since she'd entered the workshop, Jack could see something other than cold authority in her expression. She'd come expecting to witness the destruction of a failed creation. She'd come ready to order the incineration of something she viewed as heresy, as a challenge to everything the Valerian Collective believed about their right to control and reshape nature. What she was witnessing instead was transcendence. The roar continued for another 10 seconds, though time seemed to move differently during that span. Jack felt like hours were passing, or maybe only seconds compressed into something that felt eternal. When Cypher finally fell silent, the workshop seemed to exhale. The vibrations faded. The frequency dropped below human hearing. Everything returned to normal, except nothing was actually normal anymore. Everything in the room had been touched by that resonance, and Jack could see that it had been changed on some fundamental level. Cypher's breathing returned to its synchronized rhythm with the workshop's ambient systems. The dragon's golden eyes were brighter now, more alive than they'd been since Jack had brought it to his facility. The creature looked almost peaceful, as if expressing what it truly was had somehow completed something essential inside it. Director Cross stood very still for a long moment. Her enforcement officers were equally frozen, their weapons useless, their authority suddenly feeling fragile and small against what they'd just witnessed. Jack slowly stood up, his legs stiff from kneeling, and turned to face the Valerian director. "That," Jack said quietly, "is what you built. Not a weapon. Not a failed experiment. That's what happens when you stop trying to control something and just let it become what it's supposed to be." Cross looked at the dragon, then at Jack, then at her disabled officers and their useless weapons. When she spoke, her voice had changed. Some of the coldness had drained out of it, replaced by something that might have been doubt or revelation, or the sound of someone's entire worldview shifting. "We're leaving," she said flatly. Her officers moved immediately, gathering their non-functional equipment and filing toward the exit. But at the doorway, Cross paused. She turned back to look at Cypher one final time, and for just a moment, Jack saw something flicker across her face. Not acceptance exactly, but the beginning of a question. The start of a doubt about whether everything the Valerian collective believed about control and dominance and the proper order of things was actually correct. "This isn't over, Rivera," she said, her voice hollow. "The High Temple won't accept this. They'll demand answers, demand action." She paused, and when she spoke again, her words seemed to cost her something. "But perhaps we were wrong about what this creature was meant to be." Then she was gone, her team following, leaving Jack and Cypher alone in the workshop once more. Jack walked back to the dragon and placed his hand on its scaled snout. He could feel the subtle vibration still running through the creature's body, the perfect harmony of systems working together instead of against each other. "You did it," Jack whispered. "You showed them." Cypher's golden eyes closed for just a moment, and Jack could have sworn the dragon was smiling. 6 months had passed since Director Cross and her enforcement team had walked out of Jack's workshop. 6 months of waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the Valerian collective to return with overwhelming force and take what they believed was theirs. It never happened. Instead, something stranger occurred. The story spread. Someone had recorded the moment Cypher roared. Someone had captured that frequency, that transformation, that impossible display of what happened when synthetic and organic systems worked in perfect harmony instead of tearing each other apart. The video went viral across every network that mattered. Scientists wanted to study it. Philosophers wanted to debate what it meant. Engineers wanted to understand how such a thing was even possible. By month 3, research proposals had started arriving. By month 5, actual researchers had started showing up at Jack's workshop, requesting access, requesting samples, requesting anything they could get their hands on to understand what Cypher represented. Now, standing in the observation deck of the Kepler research station, Jack watched scientists in sterile suits carefully taking readings from Cypher through reinforced glass barriers. The dragon remained calm throughout the process, patient in a way that seemed almost human. The creature had been poked and prodded and scanned more times than Jack could count, and yet it never showed aggression or fear. It simply allowed the work to happen. The station itself was a marvel of cooperative engineering. It had been built specifically to study Cypher, funded by 3 different government bodies and 24 private research institutions that had suddenly decided that understanding this creature was worth massive investment. The facility orbited Kepler 442, a habitable planet that had become something of a scientific hub in recent years. From up here, looking down at the curve of the world below, Jack could almost believe that everything was going to turn out okay. Almost. He pressed his palm against the observation window, and Cypher's head turned immediately, as if the dragon had somehow known where Jack was despite the reinforced walls and distance between them. Those golden eyes locked onto his with the same intelligence they'd always carried, and Jack felt that familiar sense of connection. Some things didn't need words. Some things didn't need to be explained or rationalized or broken down into scientific components. Some things just were. Dr. Amelia Porter, the lead researcher on Cypher's case, approached Jack from behind. She was a thin woman in her 60s with silver hair and eyes that seemed to perpetually calculate solutions to problems. She'd been one of the first scientists to arrive at Jack's workshop, and unlike many of the others, she'd taken time to understand not just Cypher but also Jack's role in the dragon's transformation. "The nanomachines are showing remarkable adaptation patterns," Porter said, gesturing toward the data streaming across the monitors. "The integration with the organic tissue has become so seamless that we're having trouble identifying where one system ends and the other begins. It's like watching the emergence of an entirely new form of life." Jack nodded, though he'd heard variations of this assessment dozens of times over the past months. Scientists love to analyze, to break things down into measurable components and quantifiable data. But they kept missing the essential point. Cypher wasn't a scientific discovery. Cypher was proof of something humanity had been struggling to understand for generations. That life, real life, transcended the boundaries of what had created it. "Have you considered what this means?" Jack asked quietly. Porter turned to look at him, raising an eyebrow. I'm not sure I follow. For engineered species, Jack said. For all the creatures that have been designed and built and programmed for specific purposes. Cipher proves that they can be more than what their creators intended. That they can choose what they become. Porter was quiet for a moment, processing. That's philosophically significant, I suppose. But also dangerous from a certain perspective. If engineered life can transcend its programming, that means every control mechanism the Valerian Collective and organizations like them have built could fail. Exactly, Jack said. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. Inside the observation chamber, Cipher had settled onto the floor, still watching Jack through the layers of glass and distance. The dragon's breathing remained synchronized with the ambient systems of the research station, a habit that had developed over months of integration with various environments. The creature had learned to exist in harmony with technology, to work with it rather than against it. That evening, Jack was given access to the private study chamber where Cipher spent its downtime. It was one of the few places in the station where the dragon wasn't being actively monitored and studied. Jack had fought for this accommodation, arguing that Cipher needed space away from the constant scrutiny, time that belonged only to the dragon and to him. The moment Jack entered the chamber, Cipher rose and moved toward him. The dragon's movements were smooth and deliberate, nothing like the painful, jerky motions it had made when Jack first brought it to his workshop. The synthetic and organic systems were dancing together now, creating something that looked less like a creature with implants and more like a unified being that had always been meant to be exactly what it was. Jack placed his hand on Cipher's snout, and he felt the gentle vibration beneath his palm. The frequency was different now, more complex and refined. It contained harmonics that Jack's ears couldn't quite perceive but his body seemed to understand anyway. In that vibration, in that frequency, Jack could sense possibility. All the futures that Cipher might experience, all the potential that came from being seen and valued and allowed to become whatever it chose to be. You know what the researchers keep asking me? Jack said softly, his hand remaining on the dragon's scales. They want to know what you are. They have all these theories and data and measurements, but they still can't quite figure out what you are. Cipher made a low sound, something between a purr and a hum. I tell them the truth, Jack continued. I tell them you're something that cost 3 credits and was worth everything. The dragon leaned its head against Jack's chest, and for the first time in 6 months, Jack felt like maybe everything was going to be okay. Not because the problem was solved. The Valerian Collective was still out there. There were still forces that wanted to control and dominate and reshape life according to their design. That battle wasn't over. But standing there with Cipher, feeling the perfect synchronization of a creature that had been broken and healed and allowed to choose its own path, Jack understood something essential. The future wasn't determined by the people who built things. It was determined by the people who saw value in broken things and chose to fix them anyway. It was determined by creatures who were allowed to become more than what they were designed to be. It was determined by the simple act of connection between two beings, one organic and one synthetic, both choosing to exist together in harmony. That was worth more than any price. That was worth more than 3 credits or 3,000 credits or any currency that had ever been invented. That was worth everything.